Berserk Falcon of the Millennium Empire, chapter of the Holy Demon War, or Holy Evil War, depending on who you ask, is an simulator developed by UKs and released on the PlayStation 2 in 2004, exclusively in Japan and South Korea. Before beginning, I'd like to preface by mentioning that a popular shortening of the title is simply Berserk PS2 or Berserk Millennium Falcon. And yes, that is intentional. The creator of Berserk, Kentaro Miura, has made it no secret that he's a fan of Star Wars, and named the arc as a reference to the spaceship. And while you could also apply the same naming convention to the previous game since it also takes place in the Millennium Falcon arc, and in fact some people do, I'm going to continue to refer to it as Sword of the Berserk, and this as Millennium Falcon for distinction's sake, so keep that in mind. The game takes place more or less immediately after the events of the previous game on the Dreamcast, and rather than telling another original story, this time we simply recount the events of the Berserk manga from volumes 22 through 27, collectively known as the chapter of the Holy Demon War, or Evil War, whichever. I'd also like to take the time to correct a small mistake I made in the last video, where I said that Sword of the Berserk takes place after volume 22, when in fact I meant to say that it takes place sometime after volume 21. This is the game that takes place after 22, although it contains some scenes within 22 as well. If you haven't seen my video on the Dreamcast game, then I strongly recommend you watch that before you continue on with this video, as I will be making several mentions regarding that game and the points I made in that review. That game actually predates both the anime dub and even the English translation of the manga itself, so it's actually pretty important regarding the history of Berserk in the West. Apart from that, I'd also recommend you read the actual Berserk manga, at least up until volume 27, because this video will contain spoilers for events that occur all throughout them. If you can't stand reading, you can watch the 1997 anime or the 3 Golden Age films to get yourself mostly up to speed, and if you're really hell-bent on filling in that gap without the manga, you can also watch the 2016 anime episodes 1 to 22. As always, I recommend reading the manga above all those other options, however, for reasons I explained in the last video. As with last time, you don't technically need any knowledge of Berserk, but familiarity with the universe will allow for a more complete understanding of the events that take place, as well as protect you from spoiling past events should you ever wish to start from the beginning. Finally, of course, the video will contain spoilers for the entire game itself, including original story events which are exclusive to this title. But you may be wondering how exactly you'd be able to play this game for yourself. Because as I mentioned earlier, this game was only released in Japan and South Korea, but most of the footage that you see in this video is in English. While it is true that I own a Japanese copy of the game, complete with cover art mirroring volume 27 of the manga and garish pink disc, I've taken a few extra steps to rip the game, apply an English patch, then reburn the game onto a blank DVD, and then I had to use a swap disc program to get the PS2 to play either the burned game or the original Japanese disc. You could also try loading the game onto an IDE hard drive and then using the PS2's network adapter to hook it up and play it that way, which conveniently also bypasses region locks. That's the method I use for a majority of the footage in this review. The specific patch I'm using, and to my knowledge the only one readily and freely available at the time of this video, was created by a fellow who goes by the name Wesker90. Going through all these steps, I think, is important because PS2 emulation is still far from perfect, and this game in particular has some pretty annoying quirks when running on an emulator. Just check out those differences in the HUD. Even if you manage to fix that, you'll also run into graphical glitches, lighting issues, and it may not even run very smoothly, if at all. So if you have the means, you may not be able to crank up the resolution, but this is absolutely the way to go, in my opinion. It's simply a more honest, accurate, and authentic representation of the game as it was meant to be, except in English. Sort of. The translation is far from perfect. In fact, in some places, it isn't even complete. But it's competent enough to make it easy to distinguish what's being said and what exactly is going on. If you've read the manga, then you shouldn't have much trouble knowing what's going on with the story, even if you were to play in just Japanese. The key benefit of this patch is being able to read menus, mission descriptions, and things like that, for which it is an enormous help. I'm not going to bother making mention of all the translational oddities because, well, first of all, they're everywhere, and secondly, it's just an amateur fan project, and it gets the job done well enough. My brain can fill in any logical gaps and make whatever adjustments need to be made to fix any outstanding quirks. Hopefully yours can too. Besides, this is a review about the game, not the patch. It'd certainly be nice to see a more comprehensive and proper patch come out one of these days, or better yet, an official Western release, as unlikely as that seems. But what we have is more than serviceable. It is understandable to see why the publishers chose not to localize this time around, though. The PS2 wasn't aching for new sales or content at the time, Berserk still wasn't particularly popular in the West, the previous game wasn't all that successful abroad, and finally reviews for this new game in Japan weren't exactly lauding it with glittering praise either. Fans of the manga would simply import their own copies, and that would be good enough for them at the time, but for everyone else, the game would fall completely under the radar. At any rate, we now have a unique perspective into a game that many people either never knew about or had no way of either playing it or comprehending all that was going on within it. So I'm happy to be able to show some of it off like this. A big thanks to Wesker90 for making this possible. Anyways, it's finally time to move on to the game. Last chance to back out if you still want to play for yourself. I wouldn't get too stressed out about getting a chance to play it though, because while it looks pretty cool, it has plenty of issues that I'll be covering in due time. We'll begin with the narrative and covering where in the story the game takes place. This time around there was no future scrying ability for intrepid fans, as the manga was already ahead of all the events in the game. And the game, as the title implies, covers the events of the Holy Demon War. Holy Evil, whatever. Or at least the parts of that chapter which pertain to Guts and his party. And a majority of the story is told once again through CG cutscenes during and between missions. Much like last time, you can simply watch a compilation of all these cutscenes online in order to experience the story as it's presented in the game. You just won't get to participate in any of the fight scenes. Additionally, by actually playing, you'll also bear witness to some light participation in said story, primarily through dialogue spoken throughout the levels, but also in other ways, which I'll explain later. Naturally though, as I keep mentioning, the manga is a much better interpretation of this story than what the game ever manages to portray, so don't think for a second that you could play this game and then skip out on those chapters. It just won't work. But when it comes to a video game adaptation, suffice to say that it's not nearly as poorly paced as Sword of the Berserk was. The game this time around is about 10 hours long, and all the cutscenes sewn together take up about an hour and 15 minutes total, roughly the same total length as the last game, and the longest cutscene, not counting credits, clocked in at only about 5 minutes. Most of the heavy dialogue and expositional scenes present in the manga have been pushed aside, and the game really only cares about recreating cool scenes, establishing the mood, and setting up the next combat scenario with just a sprinkle of exposition between them. It does this in confidence because it knows that there are alternative methods, namely the manga, to explore the story on a deeper level. Contrary to Sword of the Berserk, which had to front-load all of its lengthy expositional scenes since there was nowhere else you could find them. I know I mentioned in the last video that I prefer an original story as opposed to retelling events we already know, and that still stands true. Despite all the grief I gave that game for its poor integration, I genuinely enjoyed its story as much as I enjoyed any other chapters of the manga. That said, I also enjoy the idea of going through a story I already know and participating in it myself. There's something satisfying about knowing what's coming and getting excited to see how it's been translated into the game. Kinda like watching a film adaptation of your favorite book, or an anime adaptation of your favorite... Wait, you know what, actually, never mind, forget about that part. You know what you're gonna get and what you're not gonna get going in. You know you're gonna get to fight trolls and ogres and unlock the Berserker armor, and you won't be disappointed because you didn't get to fight Zod or Griffith or something, because you already know that they aren't part of the... Oh, well, never mind then. Well, for the most part, you know what you're gonna get. It's predictable, but it's kind of fun to be able to plug yourself in there, to go through the adventure again, but this time you get to be Guts. Anytime they shoehorn extra stuff like this in, it's almost always either fan service or padding, or both, but it does add some variety to the story, so you don't always know what's coming next. It's handled in such a way that it isn't trying to rewrite the narrative, and it could even be argued that it serves to add some extra context for newcomers. Interestingly enough, this game is a bit less friendly to those newcomers who are unfamiliar with Berserk, since if you head to the World tab on a fresh save file, you won't actually find anything. You'll have to play through the game itself to unlock certain sections as they're introduced. I guess this goes some way to keeping certain contents of the game hidden until you encounter them, which makes some sense. In the last game, for example, having Zod in the World tab made it pretty clear he was probably going to appear within the game in some fashion, and so it came as no surprise when he eventually did. This time around, it was a genuine surprise to see and be able to fight him within a flashback. But some kind of short text blurb on some of the main events, themes, and characters could have gone some ways to help newcomers who really could have benefited from some kind of foothold to start off on before they actually started the game. There is at least a short story segment in the beginning of the manual, but since I can't read it, I'll have to take it on good faith that it provides something like what I just described. I just wish it was available in-game in some fashion. Again, you don't explicitly need to know about Berserk to have a good time, but it definitely helps. I could certainly see how someone might ask, wait, why did that happen? An awful lot in this game, because now, far more than before, this is a Berserk game for Berserk fans. No doubt about that. All of the relevant voice actors from the 1997 anime reprised their roles for this game, just as they did in the Dreamcast game if you played it in Japanese, so the voices should be quite recognizable if you watch the anime in Japanese, which is pretty neat. My interest, however, lies with the new actors filling in roles for characters who didn't have voices until this game. They're different from those who would fill the same roles in the 2016 anime later, but for my money, I think most of the actors for this game fit the characters better than the ones in the anime. Well, maybe except Isidro.
Wow!
But hey, have a listen for yourself. Just try not to get too caught up on the animation differences.
私は知りたいのです。私がすがった秩序を超えた真実を。そして学びたいのです。秩序の巧妙なき闇の中でも生き抜く術を。
私は知りたいのです。
私の姿、秩序を超えた真実を。そして学びたいのです。秩序の巧妙なき闇の中でも生き抜く術を。
まあ、ファルネーゼ様が旅を続けられる以上は、私も従者としてあなたともうまくやっていこうと思ってますから。
ファルネーゼ様が旅をお続けになられる以上、私も従者としてあなたとうまくやっていこうと思います。
皆さん、これを指に結んでください。ある程度ならば直接思考のやり取りが可能です。ただ、そのためには互いのオド、霊的磁力を。皆さん、これを指に結んでください。電話をできるようにします。通常をはるかに超えた意思の疎通が可能になります。
Not too shabby, huh? So anyway, let's wrap up this preamble and we'll go through the actual game story. But since I'll be summarizing an already summarized version of the original story, I seriously can't stress enough how much better it is to read the actual manga first. The purpose of this summary is not to explore the story of the manga, but to display how it's interpreted through the game, and also to explore original story elements which are exclusive to this game alone and how they fit in with the rest of that story. To help distinguish which elements are accurate to the manga and which ones were added or made up for this game, I'm going to put a red sacrificial brand in the corner of the screen for direct adaptations, and a green one for new or filler content. Bear in mind this doesn't account for any content that gets skipped over, which there's a lot of. I'll try to make note of some of these occasions as they occur, but, well, obviously you know what to do by now if you want the full picture. As always, you can skip ahead to this timecode if you'd like to get to the gameplay portion of the review. Also, full disclosure, I'm going to be pronouncing characters' names in a way that comes most naturally to me. While it's true that you can find real-world counterparts for many of them, I don't have sure confidence in pronouncing them identically with their analogs, and I feel like pronouncing them as they do in Japanese would be just like calling Guts Gatsu, so I won't bother with that either. There's really no perfect solution, so I'm just going to wing it. Just be aware that I am by no means an authority on the subject, and anyone else's pronunciations may vary. The beginning of the game opens up with a brief recount of the events of the Eclipse, an event in which Griffith, leader of the Band of the Falcons, sacrifices all of his comrades, including Guts, to a demonic legion in order to become the fifth and presumably final member of their leaders, the God Hand. For those not in the know, apart from sentencing all of his friends to brutal, agonizing deaths, this is also the scene where Griffith rapes Casca while forcing Guts to watch, and the horror of this whole event is what caused Casca to regress to an infantile mental state, and it's unclear at this point if she'll ever recover. So basically,
this guy was a real jerk.
At the apex of the horrifying event, our protagonist awakens abruptly from his nightmare. The story begins proper with Gatsu wakes up from his nightmare that I wish I could wake up from and notices that everything is fine, with Casca trying to smother Puck in a snow pile. Soon, Guts and Casca feel a sharp pain in their respective brands and some snowmen come to attack them. This is where the tutorial takes place, which is followed by a fight with a giant snow monster because this is a video game and we need to have a tutorial boss. Fair enough. It's after this that we're reminded by Puck that we're on our way to his homeland, Elfhelm, where Casca can be safe while Guts hunts down Griffith. Not long after moving forward a bit, we get a flashback to the Hill of Swords where Guts encounters Griffith for the first time since the Eclipse. Guts is understandably pissed off and rushes forward, but stops awkwardly because Rickert isn't there to hold him back for some reason. Griffith explains that he only came to see if this reunion of what's left of the Band of the Falcon could do anything to sway his heart, but after claiming that he feels nothing, decides that he is free to continue pursuing his goals. Guts rushes forward, but is stopped again by Zod, who is excited to have this opportunity to fight the Black Swordsman again, despite the fact that they apparently already fought like a week ago. There's a boss fight against Zod's human form, which is then immediately followed by his apostle form. Rather than have Casca almost die, Griffith just stops the fight presumably out of boredom, and then he flies off with Zod to achieve his dreams. This scene is used mostly to introduce Griffith as the villain for newcomers, but also I suspect because they couldn't just throw the scene right at you at the beginning, since they wanted to introduce you to the combat mechanics a little bit first. That's why it had to be a flashback. So anyway, right off the bat you get a glimpse of the duality of Guts' internal balance between protecting Casca by taking her to Elfhell and chasing revenge against Griffith and the God Hand. To help hammer this down further, during a short camping scene, Guts visualizes a black wolf in the fire and hears it speaking with his own voice. The wolf is an embodiment of Guts' inner rage, and it questions why his focus isn't bent solely on killing Griffith, suggesting that he could just easily kill Casca to eliminate her as a distraction. This is of course another nightmare induced by an incubus, because Puck is terrible at everything. However, later on Guts is fighting some spirits which attempt to harm Casca, however they end up possessing Guts to bring out the wolf. Guts begins to strangle Casca, and the wolf even tempts him to rape her, just as Griffith did. Guts goes a little bit further than just choking her in the manga, but that's understandably been left out here. Guts screams the ghosts away, but the damage has already been done, and Casca is now frightened of Guts and actively struggles against him coming near her, or even looking at her. Having someone who once loved him now be deathly terrified of him is quite a stressful development that Guts now has to deal with. Meanwhile, Isidro, a boy who idolizes Guts and is trying to find him, is looting some corpse by a river, and at the same time Farnese and Serpico, two former members of the Holy Iron Chain Knights, happen to mosey by and ask him if he knows where Guts is by any chance, though they don't make their reason for wanting to find him clear. Isidro tells them that he doesn't know either, and they walk away, but Isidro decides to follow them. Meanwhile, again, Guts and Casca find themselves within a strong blizzard. Fortunately, they're able to spot a mansion for shelter out in the distance, but they also hear a voice in the wind telling them to go away. Ignoring that, they approach the doors, which happen to be unlocked. They enter to find that the place is completely empty. Guts looks around and spots a small girlish figure watching them, but runs away once noticed. Guts chases after where the figure ran off to, and the dialogue seems to suggest that there are ghost-like people wandering the halls, but you don't actually see any except briefly during the cutscene where Guts storms into the ballroom. He approaches a painting of some noble family and then turns around to see the two children behind him, who are apparently quite upset that he intruded on their home. Before Guts can confront them, the windows shatter, and then this happens.
よう、久しぶりだな、切り込み隊長。誰だ？ご挨拶だな。忘れちまったのかよ。この声、この顔。柔道。言ったろ？戦場じゃ背中に気をつけろってな。コルカツ、ベビー。バカな、幻。
Much like when Casca woke up in the last game, this is something that caught me completely off guard. Somehow members of the former band of the Falcon have appeared before Guts and start fighting him. In the cutscene and during the fight, they tell Guts that because they all loved Griffith, they were happy to have been sacrifices for his cause, and that Guts' efforts for revenge are entirely selfish and are just an insult to their sacrifice. This is a pretty huge deal because Guts' entire motivations for revenge get put into question, and he's being forced to fight his former friends and comrades in order to continue to avenge them, which is a real brain twister. Guts does manage to defeat them, of course, but is incredibly perturbed and decides to get the hell out of there. As they leave, they turn back to see the destroyed remains of the mansion, the whole ordeal some grand illusion, assumedly by the children. As the green brand indicates, this entire mansion scene isn't in the manga at all, or in any other adaptation for that matter. This whole business with the children is exclusive to this game and will be explored further later. In the meantime, again, we have a short scene with Farnese and Serpico. Farnese has antagonized Guts on numerous occasions, and the way his worldview carelessly contradicts her devout religious roots has shaken her deeply. It's during the scene where Serpico, her bodyguard, muses on her strange obsession with Guts, unsure himself of what she intends to do when they find him. This is a much more in-depth scene in the manga, but the game skips over a lot for the sake of brevity, so I will too. A little bit later, Puck just happens to run into Isidro, who has stolen some food from Farnese and Serpico. But the situation is quickly diffused as the encounter with Puck is means for the three to finally meet up with Guts. Isidro demands that Guts teach him the ways of the sword, to which he is mostly ignored, while Farnese requests simply to follow Guts. She cuts her hair as a gesture of her abandoning her old life, since she feels her whole life until then has been a lie, and that Guts is the only one who seems to live and fight for some kind of truth that she wants to learn. Guts feigns disinterest, saying that they can do as they please, and he doesn't really care if that means following him, but he also warns them that his journey allows for very little rest. Despite sounding nonchalant, the reality is that Guts has been so at odds with his inner rage lately that he feels he has no choice but to rely on others as a means to protect Casca from himself. And so their journey together begins, with them fighting a whole army of zombie mercenaries, culminating in a fight against a big bad zombie general who has Azan's iron staff for some reason. Afterwards, the crew are about to head into a forest but are warned by an old man to be careful because trolls have been seen infesting the woods lately. Apparently, the party decides that this is as good a time as any to split up and forage for camp material. Serpico warns Guts that he'll be very angry if any harm comes to Farnese, and right on cue, Puck arrives to announce that Casca and Farnese were captured by a troll. Isidro is able to knock the girls out of the troll's grasp, but is quickly overpowered by its strength in combat. Before the troll can land the killing blow, a small witch intervenes and makes short work of dispelling the trolls with some magical spells before slinking away mysteriously. The rest of the crew is reunited, and they head further into the woods, where they come across a man under attack by some more trolls. The old man, whose name is Morgan, thanks the crew and says he's out looking for a witch's house to seek aid for his village, which has recently been under attack by the trolls as well. Rather than simply agreeing to take him home, like in the manga, Puck barges in and agrees to help the old man find the witch. Further still into the woods, the crew happen upon some children who claim to be playing around thanks to some anti-troll berries given to them by the witch. Rather than tell the crew where the witch's house is, the kids challenge them to a game of hide-and-seek and run away. Once found, they run away again. Once found again, they run away yet again. Once found a third time, you need to rescue them from a bunch of trolls for them to finally reveal where the witch's house is. Yeah, in the manga they just kinda ran into the house on accident, but I guess this level needed a gimmick. Anyway, upon reaching the witch's house, several golem guards wake up and attack. Guts fends off the golems for a time until eventually the little witch from before arrives and invites the group in. The little witch, whose name is Schierke, not Schilk by the way, accompanied by her own elf, Evilera, introduced the party to her mistress, Flora, who is also the witch that Morgan was searching for. Flora says she can't help Morgan or his village directly, but she is willing to help Guts and company if they agree to help out instead. She offers to let the party rest in her mansion as well as use a spell to temporarily dampen the effects of the brand on both Guts and Casca to help them along their journey. She also offers to send Schierke with them to help defend the village. Guts accepts, and the deal is sweetened further when Schierke provides each member a magical artifact known as a fetish. Serpico gets a magical cloak and sword that control tiny wind sprites, Isidro gets a dagger infused with tiny fire sprites, Farnese gets a silver knife to ward off demons, and both Farnese and Casca get silver chain shirts for the same effect. These fetishes and Schierke's presence in the group unlock your friend abilities, and there's a brief boss fight against a giant golem for you to try them out. With the group refreshed and refitted, they leave the mansion and head off to Morgan's village. A chunk of the time spent in Enoch Village is spent actually just walking around and talking to the townspeople. For the most part, the only thing they have to say is that life has been pretty terrible since the trolls have been attacking, and the lord of the village can't spare to send any knights or supplies, so they're pretty much doomed on their own. Schierke affixes strands of her own hair to the party's fingers to allow thought transference between members, Isidro is pouty-faced because he feels he's been pretty useless to the party, and Casca and Farnese seem to be becoming fast friends, but that's about all that's explored in this segment. In the manga, this priest vehemently protests Guts and company's presence and is obviously against any help from a witch, but here he only has like one line, and we don't really see any facet of their altercations, so he might as well not even be here. There was also trouble with people getting kidnapped by trolls, but that as well is not present in the game. Eventually, of course, the trolls do come. Guts fights through what I'm estimating to be somewhere in the vicinity of about 3.5 billion trolls until he's corralled all the straggling villagers into the church. Here he also fights another 500 million just outside the doors while Schierke stands atop the roof and incants some magical spell, and Farnese screams at some trolls that have climbed up there. Once the spell is complete, Schierke summons the 4 kings of the spiritual realm and calls upon their collective powers to erect a shield around the church, which burns up any spectral beings caught within it. Except for Puck and Evilera, of course, because they're good guys. While effective against trolls, an enormous ogre is able to stride into the fray and hurl wooden beams into the church. Guts steps forward to battle the monstrosity, but not long into the fight it begins to rain, and a strange horse frog creature called a Kelpie also arrives to cause havoc. Guts fights the Kelpie for a bit, but eventually Serpico decides to jump down and handle it himself, while Guts focuses his attention back on the ogre. During the battle, Schierke attempts another incantation, calling upon the power of the Western King to summon a flood to wash away all the monsters. 4 kings, a caster atop a church, and a flooded village. Why does that all sound so familiar? During the flood, Guts and Serpico finish off their respective foes, however a drifting chunk of house slams into the church, which causes Casca to lose her balance. Farnese attempts to catch her, but both fall into the rushing waters and are swept off by the currents. After the flooding has subsided, Schierke informs us that the girls have been captured by some trolls again, and what's left of the company gear up and head out to look for them. Even Serpico tags along, which is odd since he actually had to stay behind in the manga due to an injury. I will explain a little bit later why this was an incredibly stupid change. As the crew journey through the forest, they encounter some increasingly weird monsters until they eventually make their way to a cave which is filled to the brim with strange, otherworldly creatures. Schierke identifies this place as Cliffoth, which is sort of like the evil twin of the forest that normally resides within a realm between the physical and astral worlds, but which has somehow crossed over into the physical world and has allowed beasts like the trolls to rampage. At a seemingly random juncture, Guts orders the rest of the crew to go ahead without him while he fights off some more monsters. He takes them out, and a short time later a sudden gust of cold wind manifests, and the members of the Band of the Falcon return to harass Guts, this time accusing him of being the cause of Griffith's reclusion that sparked his dramatic downfall. After defeating them a second time, Guts once again notices the children from the mansion who run away before he can do anything. But upon traveling further into Cliffoth, yet another gust of cold wind and the Falcons appear yet again, this time with Casca among them. During the battle, the members of the Falcon accuse Guts of being selfish for never fighting for anyone but himself, and again blaming him for trying to destroy Griffith's dream, but Guts defeats them a third time, and this time is able to confront one of the children, a young boy named Charles. Charles claims that he's just playing a game where he conjures Guts' inner thoughts into reality. He also explains that the mansion he lived in was pillaged and burned down long ago, with the only survivors being him and his sister, but in the wreckage he found a Beherit, and with the appropriate sacrifice he was given the power to create illusions from thoughts. Guts defeats Charles in a one-on-one battle, but the boy manages to vanish away, leaving Guts to contemplate exactly what it was that may have been sacrificed. Further still into Cliffoth, Guts reunites with the rest of the party, and Schierke is able to detect Casca and Farnese further in, though a little bit distressed by being surrounded by monsters. Eventually the crew find the women right in the nick of time. Guts fends off about 12 billion trolls, but more and more just keep coming, so he orders the rest of the group to make their way out while he takes care of the rest. Guts slays so many trolls during the escape that eventually he's surrounded by a lake of blood and entrails. But before Guts can get much of a breather, the Falcons return once again. Guts is also a bit tired of Charles' games and demands him to show himself. However, Charles claims that it's Guts' inner turmoil that was made manifest in the form of his past comrades, and that he must first defeat his own darkness. So even when he knows it's an illusion, Guts still has to confront the doubts and internal conflict he harbors until he can finally overcome them once and for all. And so, one by one, as he fells each member, Guts makes peace with the memory of his old comrades, until he no longer harbors apprehension or uncertainty about any of his motivations, thus rendering Charles' power useless against him. This is convenient, of course, in the battle against Charles that ensues shortly afterwards, but it also strengthens Guts' character in a meaningful way that we don't really see in the manga, and all this comes into play in an incredibly fitting spot in the overall story. Guts is in the depths of Cliffoth, surrounded by carnage. It's basically like the eclipse made manifest right in front of him, once again attempting to rescue Casca from the demons, though on a slightly smaller scale, of course. Here, Guts has to face his deepest doubts head-on and in physical combat, and come to terms with what he's really motivated to do. He even has to fight his idyllic memory of Casca and accept the fact that that version of her is never coming back. Guts is transitioning to a point where he's willing to have comrades again, inviting people into his life that he can fight to protect, but also lean on for support. But before he can do that, he has to let go of his former life, to come to terms with what his relationship with the former band of the Falcon truly meant, and what his actions will continue to mean for them. And so Guts pressing through and making it out to the other side in order to defeat Charles is a very big step in the progression of Guts as a character. Definitely one of the biggest. But that's not all. After finishing off the Falcons, Guts is seemingly transported back to the Hill of Swords in order to confront... In the longest cutscene of the game, the events of the eclipse gets played back again for us in full. I guess to remind us of how much we're supposed to hate Griffith, and afterwards Guts draws his sword, and the fight begins. The two duke it out, and for the final blow, we essentially get a repeat of the duel just before Guts and Griffith parted ways. I guess this is meant to symbolize that Guts is not only stalwart in his endeavors to defeat Griffith, but also to reflect that he stands by his actions that led to their separation and respective fates in the first place. I'm a little less enthusiastic about this part of the story, as it seems to me to lean a little too heavily on the fan service aspect of it. Obviously it sounds cool in theory to have a Guts v Griffith fight, but I'm not so sure that the symbolism I hypothesized may be accurate to Guts' true feelings. It seems a little too perfect an outcome, like shameless wish fulfillment. Obviously this is just another illusion sequence, but I can't shake the feeling that it might just cheapen whatever eventual outcome Guts and Griffith come to in the end. If there ever is an end. Anyways, at this point, Charles is incredibly annoyed that Guts overcame his illusions and is now effectively immune to his power. Charles faces Guts himself once again, and of course gets his noble ass handed right back to him. Guts assumes his role as the fun police and announces that the games are officially over. The other child runs up to Charles and Guts is able to put the final pieces of the puzzle together. He explains to Charles that since apostles are only given their power after giving a tremendous sacrifice, that sacrifice is usually a loved one. Since his sister was the only other survivor of the fire, he must have sacrificed her, then used his new power to create an illusory copy of her. Charles, who claims that he just wanted to protect his sister, refuses to believe this, which suggests that he had probably been suppressing the memory of his own actions. Charles literally can't handle the truth, calling Guts a liar, and becoming so distressed at the thought of it that he assumes his apostle form in order to battle Guts one more time. The two fight, and eventually Charles finally goes down and dies at the brink of the bloody lake, just wanting to be able to go back home with his sister. And this marks the end of Charles' story, and by extension all the original story elements present in this game. Well, sort of. Miura is credited as the author, obviously because he wrote the manga that the game is based off of, but I couldn't find any information on how much, if any, direct involvement he had in writing for this game specifically. It's unclear how or where the addition of Charles came about. Did the development team have access to an unreleased or incomplete episode and decided to integrate it into the game? Did they just make it up, or was this something Miura specifically had put in as sort of a rewrite to the story in order to help flesh out Guts a bit more during this transitional period? There's pitifully little information about the development of this game, so it's possible that we may never know. Regardless of what happens to be true, I'm glad that we got what we did. It explores a side of Guts' internal conflict that we never really get to see in the manga. One of the few things this game actually manages to have over it by virtue of it simply being here. But anyway, after the short diversion, the story returns to its original track. Guts, Schierke, and Casca feel a sudden and tremendous disturbance. Schierke decides that there's very little time left and must begin a spell to seal off the entrance to Cliffoth, and sends a mental warning to Guts to get out as fast as he can. The various troll intestines and viscera that surround Guts begin to swarm together and coalesce. The intersection of the three planes of existence is allowing Slon, one of the 5 members of the God Hand, to assume a physical body, although she's not exactly thrilled to now be comprised of troll intestines. The camera also seems to suggest that Charles' death had something to do with this, but it's never explained exactly how or why, so who knows. Guts, being on a crusade to kill every member of the God Hand, immediately springs into action, but is sent off balance mid-air by one of Slon's attacks and is brought close enough for her to grab hold of him. Slon is obsessed with strong emotions, and she's particularly attracted to Guts' fiery rage, hatred, pain, and fear. She seems to derive a great amount of sexual pleasure from it, begging Guts to try and fight back. Knight of Skeleton, who is also on a crusade to defeat the God Hand, arrives in time to rescue Guts, though he offers no support in the actual fight. Meanwhile, Isidro finally finds himself useful when he manages to defend Schierke from a big nasty troll by using his small size to his advantage and cutting through it with his dagger. Schierke finishes her spell to summon the Rotting Lord and breathes a miasma of rot to defeat the rest of the pursuing trolls, and begins crumbling the entrance of the cave. If you were paying attention though, this scene kinda breaks when you remember that Serpico has been in the party all along. You see, this scene earlier where Isidro throws the bombs and then up into when he develops his tuck and roll technique is because he's the only man left in the group, and he was tasked specifically by Guts to protect the women in his absence. This is the moment that Isidro's resolve is tested, and he finally figures out that he can be useful to the group. But now that you add Serpico to the mix, and you're forced to believe that he was just standing there doing nothing the whole time, and it pretty much ruins the entire character arc. The scene no longer has any high stakes or tension. If Isidro screwed up, Serpico could have just taken over. Now, they purposely don't actually show Serpico in these pivotal scenes in hopes that you forget, but he's there. He's been there the whole time. From a gameplay perspective, having Serpico in your party means you can use his quickening ability, but with Guts separated from the rest of the group for a majority of this chapter, it defeats whatever purpose there was to having him take along in the first place. He doesn't say anything, he doesn't do anything, he just stands there. So apart from spoiling Isidro's moment of glory, it also portrays Serpico as a useless character. Him staying behind in the manga was of major plot significance, not only to advance Isidro's character, but also to build his trust in Guts to rescue Farnese. I'm willing to accept certain things in an adaptation. Skipping over some stuff for the sake of brevity, or adding in a scene or two as a bit of fan service is one thing, but altering a story thread in such a way that spoils the development of some scenes and characters, just so you can have access to an ability that you don't need and probably hardly ever used, was a colossal misstep. It seems like a small change, but it has immense consequences. I mean, if you're as pedantic about these kind of things as I am. But let's move on. Guts manages to pierce Slon straight through with his sword. Slon is too distracted by her own pleasure to really care, and she pulls Guts in to plant one right on the lips before she disintegrates back into an inert troll Guts. Guts and Guts. Sitting in Guts. K-I-S-S-I-N gross. With Slon defeated for now and the cave crumbling around them, there seems to be no time for escape. It's at this time that Skull Knight swallows his sword to coat it in the various beherits he's devoured, to create the Sword of Actu Resonansuation. The sword is able to create a tear in the very fabric of reality, which the two are able to use in order to escape. As the cave entrance finally collapses, Guts surprises everyone by walking up, seemingly out of nowhere. The party returns to the village, even though in this iteration they have no business there anymore, since there were no captured villagers to return, and Serpico didn't stay behind. Anyway, there are celebrations, and Guts is thankful to have companions again. The company make their way back to the witch's house, only to find the house on fire and the area being raided by what seems to be an army of apostles. The manga explains that the demons came specifically to kill Flora since they saw her as a threat, but no such explanation is ever given in the game. But this kinda makes a bit of sense, since the entire game has been taking place from the perspective of Guts' party. So if things aren't exposited for us like this, then I would actually consider that a bit more faithful to the stories that's being portrayed in the game. When characters in the Berserk series illustrate their plans, it's usually to their own comrades, not their enemies. Anyway, everyone except Guts, Casca, and Farnese run inside to try to rescue Flora, while Guts takes on the various apostles. Oh yeah, and Skull Knight is there because he has some connection with Flora that he's super vague about, and once again doesn't provide any support in any of the battles. After chopping through enough apostles, Zod approaches with another even larger apostle named Grunbeld at his side. Grunbeld claims to be a member of the Band of the Falcons, and challenges Guts to a one-on-one duel. In the manga, there's this whole side story where Griffith accumulates mighty warriors and the like to create a new Band of the Falcon, and Grunbeld is of course a member of this new band. But since this game only recounts Guts' exploits, we don't actually get to see this. So again, it's kinda interesting to see how this development basically comes out of nowhere from Guts' perspective, and how short a time it really was between his and Griffith's reunion and this moment. The two battle it out in an extremely one-sided fight, with Guts barely even able to scratch Grunbeld, while Grunbeld nearly pulverizes Guts to a pulp. Inside the mansion, the rest of the party locate Flora, who is in a room already engulfed in flame, and informs the crew that she's at peace with her death, and her final wish is for them to deliver to Guts a very powerful but very dangerous suit of armor that she's been tinkering with and has stowed away in the basement. Schierke is obviously upset about all this, but since there's really nothing that they can do, they head down to the basement anyway, and Schierke sends a mental image of the location of the armor to Guts to get him to join up with them. Some golems intervene to distract Grunbeld long enough for Guts to drag himself into the basement, and the rest of the crew set about putting him into the armor. With the armor on, Guts' pain evaporates and he's able to confront Grunbeld once again, this time with exponentially enhanced power and agility. As he fights, Guts' inner rage becomes greater and greater until eventually the wolf is able to overtake Guts' mind entirely, and the helmet of the armor morphs into the head of the wolf. With his increased power, Guts is able to chip away at Grimbeld's armor, and a well-placed arm cannon blast directly into Grimbeld's shield cannon destroys that as well. Grimbeld is surprised at the sudden shift in Guts' power and concedes the duel. He now transforms into his apostle form in order to challenge Guts for the sake of his duty to Griffith. During their fight, Guts sustains heavy injuries, but is unable to feel their pain. The armor is able to pierce his flesh and reinforce his bones. Left unchecked, the fury that the armor provides can eventually lead to the loss of all the owner's blood and ultimately kill them. Schierke is instructed by the voice of Flora to lead Guts back to safety, and so she projects her spirit into Guts in an attempt to quell his rage before he goes too far. She eventually locates a fragment of Guts' psyche deep within the wolf, only retained thanks to a precautionary glyph that Flora placed on the armor earlier. After reminding Guts of who he is and what he's fighting for, Guts regains his lucidity and is able to continue the fight without destroying himself completely. After an extended battle, Guts eventually defeats Grimbeld, after which Zod approaches Guts to fight him yet again. If you didn't know, in the manga, Skull Knight fights Zod while Guts and Grimbeld fight, and Guts never actually finished the battle with Grimbeld. He has to retreat in order to ensure that Casca stays safe. Skull Knight is now just standing around doing nothing, I guess so the game can thrust yet another Zod fight onto us. The fight itself is incredibly enjoyable. Battling Zod with the Berserk armor on while that amazing title track plays in the background is just about the coolest thing in the entire game. You get to fight a tougher variant of what is essentially the first real boss fight, and it manages to be your first actually challenging fight that you get to perform while in the Berserk armor. To convey the level of power you've gained, you pretty much shred Grimbeld into little pieces without any trouble after putting on the armor. But Zod is fast, strong, and hardy enough to actually feel like a real threat, even with the Berserk armor. It's clearly fan service, it's clearly a needless alteration of the story that breaks the scene, it's clearly, once again, just trying to make the game more Berserk, but god damn it if it isn't one hell of a great boss to close the game on. And don't get me wrong, it still bothers me a little to see Zod shoehorned in like this, but at least this time it makes a bit more sense since he was actually with Grimbeld at the time and he had an actual reason to be there, unlike last time where he just dropped out of the sky for no reason. Before any true victory can be achieved, however, Guts leaps from the fray to kill an apostle harassing the two women. His helmet retracts, proving that he's fully regained himself from the wolf's grip, though a patch of his hair is mysteriously turned white. He's happy to see Casca is still safe, even if she isn't happy to see him. The rest of the crew run up to join them, but they're being tailed closely by demons of their own. Once the entire group is rejoined, an enormous wall of flame separates them from the pursuing demons, and Flora's voice echoes out, urging them to make a break for it while she holds off the demons. She and Schierke say their final goodbyes as the party escapes the scene. Once the crew have made it a safe distance away, Guts collapses to the ground. Schierke fears that he may have finally bled out, but it turns out he was simply too exhausted to keep going and needed a bit of rest. The rest of the bunch breathe easy and resume their playful bickering as the camera turns skyward and the credits roll. And after the credits, we see Guts back on his feet and looking quite content as the whole party continues on their long journey together. The end. Okay, so that covers that. I don't really have many conclusive statements to go over about the story itself, since it's just an adaptation of a story that I've already read and have my own opinions of, that I tried to separate out for this review. I make it no secret that I enjoy Berserk a great deal, and that I enjoyed the volumes which this game portrays, but all I can really judge is how well that story is adapted, not the strength of the story itself. Fortunately, as should be evident now that you've seen it all, the adaptation is pretty good. I liked the original bits with Charles, and I liked how the game utilized the fact that we only see the events from the perspective of Guts and company. I obviously prefer the story as it's portrayed in the manga, but the game does a pretty good job with the material and putting its own fresh twist on it. And for that I think it's worth experiencing alongside the manga and exploring the way I just did. So when it comes to adapting a Berserk story as a game, I'd say it succeeds, and even exceeds in some instances, despite having a couple of its own pitfalls, and doing so with a great deal more finesse than Sword of the Berserk, especially in the department of pacing. When it comes to the distribution of cutscene to gameplay, the scales are now heavily in favor of gameplay. The flow of the game's story is not aided by the placing of cutscenes at the beginning and ends of missions, but by putting them wherever appropriate. Oftentimes in the middle of missions, but usually to practical effect, such as by using story elements to introduce new enemy types, like the Incubi in this case. You see it in the cutscene, now you see it in the game. Giving the cutscenes this dual purpose is not only an effective use of the work that goes into them, but also helps pull you into the story that additional bit more, which helps make you feel like you're actually part of what's happening. This is an example of the story being used more to show off the gameplay rather than the other way around. But you'll still be subject to a handful of scenes that fill out the story, which adds a little bit more depth than just deciding what you're going to fight next. Overall, I like how these cutscenes were handled a lot, but admittedly these interruptions can have the effect of breaking up the flow of the game a bit when you're suddenly pulled out of the game at seemingly random points, which can be a bit annoying, but also helps keep you on your toes. When I was younger, I always considered cutscenes a bit of a reward you'd get for continuing to play, and the quality and bite-sized nature that the cutscenes in this game have definitely give me those vibes again. I'm always happy to see one pop up. But as I've mentioned, the events in the story had already been released, so you either already knew almost everything that happened, or you could choose to dig deeper if you hadn't. The game knows this, so it acts as more of an outline of the narrative rather than a comprehensive recreation. So that means you'll be able to enjoy the juicy important bits with a cutscene, and then swiftly return to slicing through everything in your path. And so now, with all that story stuff out of the way, we can finally get on to talking about what that's like. It certainly isn't long after starting a new game that you'll realize that this game is all about its combat, and oh, what combat it is. It's not quite fair to call this game a sequel to Sword of the Berserk, because while they have a fair share of similarities, these two games are vastly different when it comes to gameplay. I speak without reservation when I say this is one of the best feeling combat systems I've felt in any game. Now to be clear, I don't mean that it's the deepest or the most fun combat, just the best feeling. You've probably heard a lot of words like game feel, or maybe some other sciencey sounding term like kinesthetics. I don't believe there's any definitive term for it, but whatever you want to call it, this game has got it. In the last game, I complained that the Dragon Slayer felt more like a piece of cardboard with how fast you swung it, but this time around the folks at UK's absolutely nailed the feeling of swinging this massive lump of iron, and it's tough to list off all the implementations they utilize to make it feel as good as it does, but here's just a few. Every time you swing the sword, it will rest at either the right or left side of your body, and will change which animation is played depending on which direction you try to swing next. This effect is also determined by the momentum of each swing, which will result in how fast or slow your next swing is. Slicing through an enemy or three will cause a slight amount of slowdown as it passes through them, and performing a swing attack requires a long charge up, and once executed, will require a long cooldown to recover from, and the sheer momentum of the swing may cause you to fall down if your stats aren't upgraded enough. The speed and direction you're running will also have an effect on your swings, as well as swinging after a dodge. The animations, which were motion captured from live actors, convey the perfect level of weight that you're expecting to see. Guts is obviously meant to be able to swing his massive sword with ease, but you still feel that weight with each swing, punctuated by the slight rumble in your controller. And do I even have to go on? There's no way you can't tell simply by watching footage of this game just how good it looks and feels. And to make the combat feel even better, you've got an amazing dismemberment system that lets you chop off limbs or cut enemies in half vertically or horizontally. Not only that, but you may also notice that your sword can even slice off chunks of the body that are already detached and flying off through the air. All these effects really go a long way to delivering that Berserk experience, since virtually any scene in the manga that has Guts swinging his sword is accompanied by copious dismemberment, and they really captured that effect in this game. You can really feel the power behind your swings, since a large portion of monsters go down in just one blow. In defense of the Dreamcast game, Sword of the Berserk had some light dismemberment too, but nothing like this. And yet with all the praise I've just given, I've only been talking about basic swing attacks. There's still so much more to do with the combat. Holding down R1 will have Guts point his sword forward and unlocks a quicker and more focused combo of sword swings, also determined by the direction you tilt the movement stick. This is meant to be a targeting system of sorts. On bosses, this becomes a sort of Z-target reticle, which is good for tracking the boss while moving, but on normal enemies, it's all about which way you were facing when you raised the sword. This can be awkward to anticipate, especially since it can be difficult to determine which way Guts will face if he's in the middle of a wide sweeping animation. It's not a true lock-on, and I'm not certain as to whether or not there's any snapping involved, but if you can master it, then it opens up a great number of options for how you can swing your sword. Mashing the same button over and over again will often result in a short cooldown animation, so you have to use this focused mode wisely. Every once in a while, when you're fighting, the symbol of the brand will pop up on your health meter. If you hit the triangle while this icon is visible, then Guts will do a short dash, and if there's an enemy in the way, he'll perform an execution move which will insta-kill whatever monster he catches, save for bosses. These execution moves will change depending on which monster you connect with. Some executions even have an area of effect which can damage or kill surrounding enemies as well. So experimenting and discovering the best enemies to perform these moves on, to either instantly kill a large enemy or several smaller enemies, adds a decent bit of depth. Plus they're just plain fun to watch. Next up on the docket, we have that beautiful Berserk mode making its return. The mode itself functions quite similarly to how it worked in the Dreamcast game. The screen goes red, and Guts goes wild. This time, however, you can only raise the gauge by making kills, and it isn't triggered automatically whenever the meter fills up. You can trigger Berserk mode at any time you want as long as the meter is partially filled, and you can also cancel out of it by tapping R2 again in case you don't want to blow through it all in one go. But you will be subjected to a short cooldown animation upon exiting Berserk mode. On top of that, Berserk mode also causes the brand to appear much more frequently, so if you're real cunning, you can trigger Berserk mode until the brand appears, cancel out, then quickly tap triangle to launch yourself into an execution attack and recharge some of the meter again. Overall, Berserk mode is a much more fluid and robust addition to your arsenal, though I do feel that it cheapens the mode thematically a tad. In the Dreamcast game, it triggers automatically after it built up whenever it gets connected with his sword or took a hit, and that seems a bit more honest to the source. It's not something that's within Guts' control, it's something that creeps up on him whenever he's in battle. It was useful when it appeared, but it wasn't something you could rely on implicitly. This time around, Guts has full control over it. You could even go through the whole game without ever activating it, and while it certainly benefits Guts on the occasions where he loses control like that, it's portrayed in this game more as a tactical utility rather than the debilitating condition that it's meant to be. On the other hand, it does make more sense for Guts to burst into a rage when he's surrounded by enemies rather than for him to go into a sudden frenzy when there's only like 1 or 2 enemies left. And you could argue that Guts has some control in when he lets himself go wild, so I don't think it's flat out trampling over an element of the narrative. I do still think this was better implemented here than in the Dreamcast game. It can be difficult to think of a way that you could implement this correctly. Perhaps limit the use to only after you've lost a certain amount of health, or set some length of time from when you've cancelled out to when you can activate it again. Overall, it's not a huge deal, but it's clear that there's room for some tweaks to make it a bit more logically consistent, and to help prevent the mode from being abused. But that's all I have to say about that. It's still a blast to use anyway. Guts once again has all his weapons from the previous game, and this time, rather than be ammo-based, they now run on cooldown timers once fully expended. The crossbow has a bit more utility than before, since you can use it the same way as you could previously, but if you hold down R1 to go into target mode, you can also use it while on the go, and it'll dispense of any trash mobs caught within its line of fire, making it quite good for crowd control since it can take a while to run through all the ammo, especially when upgraded. The knives are once again just as useless, but at least now you can waste XP by purchasing an upgrade to throw more at once and do just as little damage. Bombs have been given an immense buff, being able to wipe out any non-boss enemy within its blast. With upgrades to throw more at once and increased range, all that extra power and increased refresh rate can make it arguably even better than the arm cannon. But the arm cannon too is still available and unleashes that oh so delightful explosion that will obliterate enemies and take out huge chunks of health from bosses. But that's not all. The arm cannon has some added utility where you can use the backwards momentum of the blast to launch into 2 different swing attacks depending on when you press the button. Maneuvers Guts performs on occasion in the actual manga, and is incredibly satisfying to pull off yourself. At the start of the game, you'll have access to Puck's healing abilities, and after receiving the fetishes from the witch's house, you also have access to some of their abilities as well. Isidro's dagger will cause a small blast, not unlike your bombs. Serpico's sword will quicken you, which effectively freezes time temporarily, and Schierke's spell will increase your defense for a short while. These can all be pretty useful, but there's a short cutscene that plays before each of them that can get a bit annoying. To their credit, they change slightly if you level them up, but it's mostly just a waste of time in my opinion. I always prefer it when I get the fairy dust so I don't have to see Pucks dance every single time I need to heal. Too bad there's no option to skip them, but oh well. What's even less exciting about these abilities is the fact that they get taken away from you at a certain part of the story for seemingly no reason. And what's worse about this is that there doesn't seem to be any consistency for why the abilities are taken away. During the troll raid at Enoch, Guts is technically on his own while everyone else is at the church, but he still has access to their abilities. Yet in Cliffoth, the group is separated again, but only now you're not allowed to use them. This isn't the case with Puck, however, who will leave a bag of dust for you to use if he himself ever leaves your side, as he did in the mansion. Obviously, the developers didn't want to leave you without a way to heal yourself, but it begs the question, why isn't the same applied to the other abilities? Just leave a picture of the fetish when the users leave the party. Yeah, it goes against the narrative a little bit, but it would seem to me to be an inconsistency worth having if it meant consistency of gameplay. You could even then leave Serpico in the village, fixing a much larger plot hole. In the end, you only have to make it through 1/2 of one level without them. But it still bothers me since it can make their usability uncertain, which discourages you from trying to level them up at all. I get that they wanted to have Guts on his own for certain segments, but it casts unneeded uncertainty in your arsenal. The story is tampering with the gameplay in ways that it just shouldn't. But regardless, from the multitude of sword swings, to execution moves, to berserk rage, to alternate weapons, to your buddy abilities, you've got some pretty wide options for how you handle combat. Now there isn't any sort of deep combo system or complex tactics you can use to perform intricate maneuvers, but you have enough options to make up your own techniques and eke out any nuances with what you're given, which is a good thing because once again, this game is all about its combat. Your first time through any level, you'll be up against an infinitely respawning horde of enemies on your way to the next objective, and this really hammers down that theme of Guts being constantly assaulted by demons with little to no rest. You truly feel that sense of helplessness as the enemies keep pouring in while you slowly make your way forward, and you may be tempted to just run past everything like last time rather than waste time chopping through them all. However, once you've separated a beast's memories from its body, you'll be given a small XP drop. With enough XP, you can invest in certain stats like your sword abilities and sub-weapons. This is a really great inclusion because it helps to disincentivize that desire to just run past enemies. Now you have a reason to take the time to slice up any enemies in your way because it'll go towards advancing your stats. Unfortunately, I'm sad to say this XP system wasn't really fleshed out too well. A lot of enemies go down in one hit and they'll only drop 5 XP. Some bigger monsters take more hits to kill and they'll drop 100 XP. Then there are these tree monsters that are wicked annoying and take multiple hits to kill, and they drop 300 XP. And then there's... oh wait, no, there's not. That's it. Across all the multiple enemy varieties throughout the entire game, not including bosses, there are only 3 different XP drops. It's definitely disheartening to fight an enemy that's harder to kill and get the same amount of XP as the one from a couple levels ago that barely put up any fight at all. I made a similar complaint about health drops in Metroid. Enemies advance in difficulty, but the rewards don't scale with them. Simply making marginal increments from say 5 to 6 to 7 XP for one-hit critters and 100 to 110 to 120 for larger ones could have lessened this effect considerably, just enough to make you feel like you're actually progressing. You could even scale the XP needed for leveling skills to make up for the extra XP being given away. You don't have to make acquiring the amount of XP any different, you just have to trick me into thinking you did. Seeing the price of upgrades go up exponentially while my XP drops stay the same is disheartening and damages any sense of progression. Some games build their entire models around exponential increase of numbers, and while that can be abused to exploitative extents in those games, the methodology involved can be used to complement the core mechanics of a game. If you're meant to believe that you're getting stronger and fighting tougher enemies, it helps to see some bigger numbers to provide an indication of that growth. This can be taken further through the likes of upgrades or the expansion in abilities, moves, or weapons, and to its credit, Millennium Falcon does do some of this, but larger XP drops is a good and easily implementable place to start, and it's an instantly recognizable bedrock in which to build your progression system. Now I should mention, the XP drops aren't quite as shallow as I make them out to be, as there are alternative ways of gaining XP. Chiefly, there's a kill combo meter that pops up in the lower right of the screen. Each enemy you kill makes the counter go up by 1 so long as you make each consecutive kill before the combo times out. The higher the combo, the higher the XP drop you'll get once it ends. This not only incentivizes you to kill, but to kill efficiently and without stopping, which is definitely the right mindset you want to put players in for a Berserk game. The combo caps out of exponential XP increase after about 100 kills, but there's no reason to end the combo if you can manage to keep it going in order to sustain those maximum XP gains. Apart from that, there are also some little critters called Spriggans hidden in each level that can give you an XP prize, but I'll talk about them more a bit later. So the XP assigned to individual enemies is pretty dull, but at least you won't go starving for it if you can keep a good combo going. But you may think to go back to an earlier level so you can farm enemies that are easier to kill, but that won't be possible either. You see, after you've beaten a level, if you go back to play through it again, the enemies are no longer infinite. Each level has a fixed number of enemies now, the amount of which is indicated by a percentage on the pause menu and level description. Once you've killed them all and cleared out all the branded locations, that's it, they're gone forever. Which means after you've played through all the levels once, there's now a finite amount of XP left in the game. But no need to freak out about that though. There should be enough to max out all your stats if you really want to, and there's also a New Game Plus you can opt into which will carry over your XP and levels, so it isn't as bad as it sounds. There are positives and negatives to all this. On one hand, it's a clever implementation to prevent players from farming through easy enemies, but of course there's nothing stopping you from farming enemies in levels which you haven't finished yet. What I really don't understand is why the total monster percentage isn't just applied to the levels the first time around. There are plenty of enemies in that 100% to fill the level far more than what's necessary, so as long as you keep the number hidden until the level is completed the first time, could go a good ways towards reducing some of the tedium needed to clear out the levels your second time through. Hell, you can keep the hordes of monsters infinite to prevent a patient player from clearing them all out at the beginning of a level, but you can also reward a player for their efforts by reducing the percentage a little bit each time they kill enemies outside of the main mission scenarios. Seeing each new level at 100% saturation is demoralizing, whereas it would have been nice to see that you at least made a dent in their numbers, especially since you still have to go through and clear out specific areas marked by the brand that only appear when you return to the level. You can keep monsters infinite so there's always enough XP to go around and levels don't suddenly become barren, and you can reduce some of the grinding required to clear out levels the second time through. Unfortunately, this simply isn't the case. Once you've got your XP though, you can invest it into one of many stats, and these can range from increasing your defense, shortening the cooldown on your items, increasing the efficacy of those items, and even unlocking more sword swing techniques to perform. Curiously, some sword upgrades don't unlock new moves, but simply change the moveset entirely. I guess this is meant to represent Guts using more advanced techniques with greater skill, but it can be weird to suddenly have a move you may have grown accustomed to suddenly be switched out with something completely different. On one hand, it makes sense that Guts would use a different tactic if he intends on incorporating more swings, but on the other it feels like a gamble to upgrade since you don't know if this new set of swings will actually work out better than the last. One upgrade I enjoyed quite a bit was the spin attack. If you charge it up to the max but you don't have the skill required to actually swing that many times, Guts will fall over and take a while to get back up. I enjoy that dynamic of pacing yourself so that Guts can actually keep up with your inputs, and I wish other upgrades leaned more towards this kind of implementation. You can only spend XP at save locations scattered throughout levels or between chapters themselves. It gives you a little something more to do and look forward to when you reach these points other than just the ability to save or read up on the world. There's plenty of tantalizing choices to spend your XP on and plenty of XP needed to collect in order to unlock everything, so when it comes to how you actually get to use XP, it reinforces the desire to continue slaying enemies in order to get more of it, which in turn goes some lengths in the matter of progression. But just as XP variety is rather dull, so too is the enemy variety. I mentioned before that a lot of enemies go down in one hit, unless it's a grazing blow, but for a hefty portion of the game you'll just be slicing through enemies without any trouble at all. Their behavior is rarely worth considering as you only need to put them within range of your sword. So across all the multiple levels you'll be facing enemies which change visually, but are dealt with, for the most part, in the same fashion. Swing your sword, move forward, repeat. The larger enemies, which take more hits, are a bit more distinct, being more aggressive and having slightly different attack patterns, and can have a fair amount of variety between types. For instance, one might be a bit faster, and another might be able to withstand a bit more punishment, but even they have a great deal of homogeneity. Some kind of jump or flail attack, and a charge is about the extent you can expect among them all. Once you've finished a chapter and make your way to the next, it's only a matter of figuring out which ones are the analogs to the enemies from the previous level and apply the same techniques you were just using on the other guys, so it's back to the usual grind. Also, ogres become single-hit enemies while large trolls take like 10? What's up with that, man? That's backwards. The number of enemies you need to deal with in one stage, combined with the sheer size of the levels, can seriously dampen your enjoyment of the combat, which, hey, might be thematically appropriate, but it also demoralizes you from playing at all. Let's take the entirety of Chapter 2, for example. You make your way forward, slicing through undead mercenaries, and you've even got the newly introduced crossbowmen to keep you on your toes. And so you make your way forward till you reach a point where you have to stand your ground and survive an onslaught of zombies. After that, you decide you need to quell their numbers before you can progress. How do you do that? You need to make your way to their camp and do another stand your ground mission to empty out the camp. Easy enough, but then you gotta do that again. And again. And again. And again. The same mission repeated 5 times, all the while you need to make your way through the endlessly twisting hallways of infinitely spawning enemies throughout this enormous map to reach each camp, and only after all that does it spare you by teleporting you back to the center so you can save and fight the boss. I don't even bother fighting enemies between camps because I'm not interested in adding 60 more hours to my playtime. You're faster than they are, and there's no reason not to run past them other than that you'll miss out on a bit of XP. But if you're good at keeping a combo going, then that's really not an issue either, especially if you go back to clear out the level later. So advancing to a new chapter, only to find enemies that are more or less exactly as they were the last time except they've been palette swapped and can jump now, and then walking forward to discover yet more stand your ground missions, tends to weaken the spirit. Rather, I'd say a majority of the attention regarding enemy design was given to the bosses, who thankfully have been given a great deal more care. Namely, the attention to detail where bosses will inherit the fighting attributes and combat gimmicks of their manga counterparts. Here's just a few examples. Regarding the Falcons, Judo is fast, running around to throw knives and moving in on your flanks. Pippin is a brute who will charge forward and body block you, and of course Corcus is a coward who constantly tries to stay as far away from you as possible, and even his counters are just him running away. Once Casca joins in, she's relentlessly aggressive and is quick to get in on the offensive once beat back. Even if you've never read the manga, you get a clear sense of each character's attitudes, simply by observing their fighting styles. In the manga, Serpico used his increased speed he gained from his cloak to get in and strike the Kelpie, and you can do the same by using his ability to get in some quick and easy hits. Also in the manga, Guts used his arm cannon on Slon in order to wrestle free from her grip, and this is something you can recreate in the game if your arm cannon ammo is filled and you happen to get grabbed. Sure, it's just a glorified QuickTime event, but it's exponentially more satisfying to perform this way than if they were to show it off in a cutscene of some kind. But it's moments like this that help the actual gameplay feel like it's integrated with the story, not in an overt, your actions have consequences way, but as a subtle, knowing gesture, and it makes all the difference for anyone who's a fan of the series. Original elements like the Zombie General and Charles also have combat tactics that fit their characterizations. The General calls in reinforcement grunts and orders cannon attacks, and Charles's attacks are more often about confusion and disorientation, teleporting around the arena and throwing spells that reverse your movement controls. But, unfortunately, even the bosses are plagued with their own problems, primarily the fact that many of them get repeated or reused. Zod, the Falcons, Charles, the Ogre, Slon, and Grunbeld all have more than one boss fight associated with them, and it's not even counting stuff like apostle forms. Defeating a boss only for a cutscene to play and have the boss return to full health to be fought through again isn't particularly fun, especially after the second or third time it's happened. And it's really not like a multi-phase battle or something, it's mostly just the same fight over again, maybe with a slight difference in the environment or some basic enemies joining in. I talked about forced failure and false starts in my Xenoblade video and the aggravation I had with that, but this isn't either of those, it's just fight the boss again, because we said so. Sometimes it's used to help highlight elements of the story like fighting Grunbeld before and after receiving the Berserk armor, but then there's stuff like fight the Ogre, now fight the Kelpie, now fight the Ogre again, now watch this cutscene and then fight the Ogre again. I think the lineup of bosses is quite strong as it is, each boss distinct and well designed in each individual case. There didn't need to be as much repetition as there was. The game would be better off without them, even if it meant that there would be fewer boss encounters. So, cut the second Ogre fight, just jump into the Flooded fight. Cut the second and third Falcon fights, the first and fourth are fine on their own. Cut the second Charles fight, and just skip straight to the Apostle battle. Then cut the first Slon fight, and if you have to, you can separate the phases of the fight between the two health bars. As it is now, these fights are just bloat and only reinforce the theme of monotonous repetition present with the normal enemies and missions. Now, chapters and levels themselves do bring forward a bit of variety other than their visual design. Just a little, though. Chapter 1 is just your run-of-the-mill, make it from one end to the other, but detours at Charles's mansion for its second half. Chapter 2 has the 5 camps to evacuate, Chapter 3 has the hide-and-seek with the kids, Chapter 4 lets you walk about with the townspeople for a bit, Chapter 5 is split into 2 massive disorienting mazes and like 50 boss fights, and then Chapter 6 is pretty much nothing but Berserk armor fun time. And while the slight change in level structure is nice, it's still pretty weak, especially since no matter what kind of mission you're doing, it all boils down to make your way to point A, kill a billion enemies, make your way to point B, kill another billion enemies, and so on and so forth until you reach the boss or bosses. Exacerbated further when these mission points are spread out across levels so huge and empty, with nothing to occupy you on the long treks except the constant flow of the same enemies over and over again, potentially traveling down extended paths and turns which lead only to dead ends, forcing you to turn back and make your way back to where you began and waste more and more of your time. But you know, maybe the level design is meant to be a deep metaphor. Guts has to travel on a long and crooked journey, filled with limitless enemies, death waiting around every corner. There are no correct paths, it's all a grueling slog against the forces of evil, and any wrong turn just means that things will get worse and worse, compounding on each other, and at the end of every decision lies the same grim fate, continuous and relentless battle. Or maybe this game was designed by a studio whose body of work consists of 95% wrestling games, so while they can nail the feeling of fighting stuff, they don't exactly have much experience designing intricate or interesting levels or missions. You can feel a clear sense of passion in this title with the level of detail that's been poured into it, but all the passion in the world can't make up for a lack in competence. Hey, thanks for watching this, by the way. The barren openness of the levels gives the impression that there was meant to be more content to occupy them, and as a result makes all the levels feel unfinished. So, it's possible I'm being a bit too harsh on the development team. Maybe there just simply wasn't enough time to fill in the game with as much content as they wanted to. It's an unfortunate reality that a lot of games face, but regardless of what may have happened behind the scenes, what we got is what we got. There aren't any side quests and nothing to gain from exploration other than perhaps running into a Spriggan, most of which are just placed in the middle of the road where it's impossible for you not to notice them. I guess this is as good a time as any to talk about them, though. Spriggans come in 3 varieties. The green ones will give you some XP, the yellow ones will refill all your gauges, so your health, berserk meter, weapons, and your friend abilities, and finally, the red ones, which will only appear when you replay a level, will allow you to raise one of your stats +1 beyond the max. So there's not a whole lot to them other than being something nice to find. The red ones will give you something to look out for if you plan on clearing out all the levels, but apart from that, they're pretty boring. Speaking of boring, completing the game on different difficulties doesn't unlock any new content, but seeing how this is a much longer game that is much more tedious to get through, I would count that as a blessing. You can set the difficulty to whatever you like and not have to worry about missing out on anything. But that brings up the fact that additional content is lacking somewhat as well. Upon completing the game once, you unlock the hilariously named 100 Animal Murder Mode, which is a bit of a misleading title since you often fight way more than 100, or sometimes just 1. What sets this mode apart from every other battle scenario in the game is that it applies restrictions to your battle. Kill everything in the given time limit, kill everything in the Berserk armor, kill everything without using friend abilities, stuff like that. These extra missions offer a decent challenge and are much more tolerable than the main story since there's no in-between bits or running around, it's just one battle with some basic rules. And this is cool because it really teases out the depth in the combat by enforcing these restrictions, which encourages you to explore that depth to its fullest. Not only that, but you can't make the fights any easier or harder on yourself by grinding out your stats, since they cleverly implemented preset stats for each mission. And truly, I think completing these challenges is the reward itself. They are by far my favorite part of the game because they shear off all the extraneous bits and just leave the core gameplay to shine. But that brings me to the actual rewards. Sort of. For every challenge you beat, you unlock a new weapon. But before you get too excited, know that rather than unlocking an actual weapon, you are instead unlocking a weapon skin. The new weapons, in reality, don't change anything. Guts holds them in the same way that he holds the Dragon Slayer, they have the same reach and play the same animations, and as you would expect, that makes a lot of them look pretty goofy. Now, I'm not upset at the weapons just being skins, because as I said, the challenges to get them are fun enough on their own, and I think playing around with these cosmetic swaps is pretty fun in its own right as well. But if you complete all the 100 animal murder missions, you'll notice there's one secret weapon left to unlock, with no indication on how to go about unlocking it. So, how do you get it? Well, remember that enemy saturation you see when re-entering a stage? Yep. As it turns out, this particular weapon is achievable by going through the 5 main chapters again, finding all the branded points on the map where you have to kill a bunch of enemies, then kill all the respawning enemies over and over and over again until the saturation finally hits 0% on all of them. If this sounds like the ultimate tedium-filled slogfest, that's because it absolutely is. It took me way too long to do this, and I cannot express just how terribly boring this was, and how much I recommend against it. Each time you clear a level, it teases that you received a shard of an ultimate weapon. I was fortunate enough to know that it was just another weapon skin, so I didn't have to get my hopes up, but no matter how you spin it, this whole ordeal is just the worst. So what is this super secret weapon you worked so hard to unlock? Well, it just so happens to be... Puck's Thistle. A ridiculously stupid weapon fitting of a ridiculously stupid challenge. But believe me, as much as I hated going through the requirements to get this, I'm not actually very bitter about it. I knew what was coming, and I was just going through it for the sake of completion, but I feel sorry for the poor saps who may have been expecting something more. While it's not really related to this game, I at least prefer knowing that I busted my ass to earn some dumb cosmetic rather than busting out my credit card. I won't dig into that here, though. It is a shame that the only rewards for doing extra content are weapon skins. I would have loved another no-limit mode, or hell, even something like Puck's Game 2, Revenge of the Betchy. It is pretty neat how they run the gamut for pretty much every major weapon featured in the manga up to this point, and even a couple of original ones, and it's fun to take them all out for a spin, but it's just rather underwhelming that these are the only things that you have to work for. Not even the boss mode you can unlock has any rewards unless you count the mode in and of itself as a reward, which, kinda, but at least Sword of the Berserk gave you some artwork to unlock. But, as we come around to wrapping things up, it could not have gone without mentioning that throughout the long hours you spend chugging your way through this game, none of them were aided in any part by the equally underwhelming soundtrack. Susumu Hirasawa returns to provide his musical expertise for 2 tracks, the title track and the ending track, which is just a slowed down variation of the title track. And while both of these tracks are an absolute delight, there's only one occasion where you actually get to hear one of them during gameplay. Everything else was created by composers from Sound Ams, and, well, if I had to describe the soundtrack in one word, that word would be drone. It's almost entirely either ambience and atmospheric droning, or otherwise rather generic battle music, lots of drums and trumpets accompanied by vocal drones without any discernible tune that all tend to sound quite similar. If you felt like you've been tuning out the background music in this video because it's been so bland, well, that's because you have. I don't want to be too hard on it though, it does set the appropriate mood for the scenes, and with anything regarding Berserk, that mood is often dark and dreary, so it can be hard to deviate very far into something more ear-catching in your sound. Plus, there are some tracks that I found to be fairly enjoyable, like the theme that plays when you fight the Falcons. I also have a soft spot for this weird trumpet mess that plays in Cliffoth that reminds me a lot of Resident Evil. Musical taste is subjective, of course, but I definitely get the impression that even the blandest of the Dreamcast tracks had a bit more character to them than anything present here, apart from the Hirasawa tracks, of course. It's just a shame that with some levels lasting so long, you'll be listening to these fairly unimpressive tracks repeatedly, and none of them will manage to stick with you after you've turned the console off. The soundtrack received a physical release, but I have yet to dig up any praise towards any aspect other than Hirasawa's contributions, which are fantastic in their own right, but only act as a beautiful mask to distract you from the homely face that lies just beneath. And that's an unfortunately succinct way to describe the entirety of Millennium Falcon overall. You have an incredible level of presentation with an instantly gripping and engaging feeling of interaction with your character, but once you've scratched off the surface layer of any feature, you'll almost always find it lacking. Even the good stuff, like the combat and the original story bits, which are both exceptionally good, gets weighted down by how unremarkably the rest of the game has been put together. There are plenty of moments that just put a big dumb grin on my face being translated into the game format in such a caring way to give them the weight and gravitas that they deserve. But that's all they end up being. Moments. Caught within this slurry of bland and monotonous tedium that fails to hold a grip on my interest for any meaningful length of time. You can get a firm grasp of the tedium present in this game simply by playing through the tutorial. You're given separate scenarios for each button and some enemies to practice on. Rather than test your ability to perform a certain action, like making you perform that specific action at least 3 times, you just have to kill the enemies. You don't even have to use the button you're meant to be introduced to. You can just use basic attacks to wipe out all the enemies for each mission and you'll be good to go. And of course, they don't just throw a handful of enemies against you. No, they throw like 50 for each mission. Do they honestly expect you to use the block counter to kill 50 different enemies? Of course not. You'll try out the block and you'll have to waste 3 minutes hacking through the enemies normally just to get the mission over with. So you can do the same mission over again, but this time you can dodge now. Woo! As boring as it is, at least there is a tutorial, unlike the last time, and you can skip it if you'd like, so that's a plus. It can be a bit of a leap to jump straight into the tutorial boss, but it's easy enough that it shouldn't be too much of a challenge to get through, but I digress. Presentation-wise, the game does a superb job with its depiction of Berserk material. Well-paced cinematics with great voice acting, fantastic character animations, and game interactions that satisfyingly mirror those of the manga. There was phenomenal improvement when it comes to the pacing of story and gameplay, but unfortunately the improper balance of gameplay itself is now front and center. Swinging your sword over and over to kill hordes of samey enemies mission after mission gets tiring quickly, and there's virtually no side content or resting periods to help ease that fatigue. I compared the last game to an arcadey beat-em-up, and while Millennium Falcon has managed to ditch that feeling in its fighting mechanics, it still retains the same level-by-level depth of content despite having been translated across much larger and longer levels, and the two don't really mesh well at all, with few redeeming qualities to really make it worth your while. I'm reminded of Shadow of the Colossus. In that game there wasn't any side content, only a few things to find out and about a massive empty map, and the focus of the game was primarily about its combat. I'm greatly oversimplifying that, of course, but what separates Shadow of the Colossus from Millennium Falcon is that Shadow of the Colossus introduced vastly different scenarios with each encounter, and designed its enemies so that each one provided a unique experience that had to be approached in a different, yet similar way each time. Each boss is about striking its weak spot, but how you find and get to that weak spot requires vastly different methods each time. Even though your character never gained any new abilities or moves, you were given different ways to exploit the moves you've had since the very beginning through the enemy and level designs. Now, these games aren't easily comparable, but the reason I bring it up is to illuminate that you can have a barren world without side quests or a variety of mission types and things to do. You don't have to conform to traditional game conventions. You can do things differently from the norm, but if you're going to do that, you have to make up the difference elsewhere. Shadow of the Colossus did this, in part, by making all of its bosses a unique experience, and it paid dividends. But Millennium Falcon, well, it doesn't do anything. Rather than build enemies that can counter or complement your fighting ability, they just throw more of the same at you. My criticism is not that Millennium Falcon is empty or doesn't have enough stuff in it, but that if it wasn't going to flesh out its gameplay in breadth, then it needs to fill the gap some other way with what it does have. The combat doesn't need to have a great deal of depth if there's something unique about the way you use it. Enemy design doesn't really get any more complex from the first enemies, and your approach in dealing with them won't change either. You are going through the motions from point A to B, and that is all you will do from the first chapter to the last. You can pretty it up with great attention to detail, fluid animations, and satisfying feeling combat, but that won't make up for a game that at its heart is plain and dull.
You didn't notice that Casca put on a dress for the celebration, did you?
Did she?
I think Casca was hoping that you would stuff her like a Thanksgiving turkey.